Welcome to Dialogue on Teaching. I am Nancy Lynn Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. Paul Myrie, Senior Associate Director of the Wabash Center, is our sound engineer. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show Dr. Stephen C. Finley. Dr. Finley is Associate Professor at Louisiana State University. He works in the Department of African and African American Studies, as well as the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. Welcome, Stephen, back to the conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's beautiful being here again.
So we have begun to hear, as schools move toward diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Fabulous, right? That they are using the notion of harm to try to describe and undergird policies and procedures about offenses, about racist, sexist offenses, right? Homophobic offenses. Help us know what is harmful about racism, what is harmful about oppression, what is harmful about bias and bigotry. What is the notion of harm?
Yes, that's a really good question, this notion of harm when it comes to racism, because people don't always know what that means. And people think of harm in different ways. But I like to think of it in particular in terms of the material effects. And so racism for me has a lot to do with limiting resources that injure people emotionally and physically and so on. But there are two sides to this. In a chapter that I wrote in a book that's along these lines, The Religion of White Rage, I argue actually that racism, that is white anti-Blackness, holds back African-American development because whiteness needs it for its own identity. The flip side of that, though, is because whiteness is so tethered to Blackness in ways that that lead to material harm and psychological and other forms of harm, but it also keeps whiteness from being as developed as it could be because it is dependent upon Blackness as an object for its own identity and its own meaning.
I think that's absolutely true, spiritually, sociologically, economically, across the board. I used to work with Jim Forbes at Riverside Church.
Yeah.
Jim Forbes used to talk about the problem with racism is you have your boot on my neck and I can't go anywhere, but neither can you.
But this is
that
the part
we are
of it,
stuck together, right?
That's right.
In this.
But this is the part that people largely don't get. That you're keeping me from developing. You're keeping material resources from me. You're doing all kinds of violent and injurious things to me and my community, while at the same time, those same things are keeping you in that same position in order to maintain, that power that is necessary for you to be able to injure my community in the way that you have. And so, I like to look at this from two sides. Of course, first from the side of those people who are primarily being injured by what racism does directly, people of color, African Americans, Native Americans in particular. But the point that, and I'm thinking about this along a binary logic because that's the way race basically functions in America. It's basically white, Black, and everything revolves around that. And I like to point out to when I'm talking about whiteness, about how racism affects everybody. It affects other communities and the people who perpetrate it as well, even though they see material and erotic and social and material gains. The world could be so much more, right? If we would just let go and help one another develop, which, by the way, is what I think Du Bois was actually trying to get to in his famous essay that people are always misreading, called The Conservation of the Races. I really think that's really where he was trying to go when he wanted to conserve this notion of race and enable all the races to give their gifts to this ultimate unfolding and resolution of humanity that he thought would be really great.
So
Right.
Ta-Nehisi Coates said it was not race that created racism, it was racism that created race.
That's right. That's right.
Help us understand that, because that's part of the Du Boisian
Yeah.
piece.
Yeah, it is. And I think one of the things Du Bois was trying to do is to rethink race in a modern framework. And I think one of the things he was trying to argue is that we understand race as too modern. In other words, he wants to see it as something that is evolutionary, something that existed before its modern iterations, right? Maybe not the concept of race, but these social groupings that Lucius Outlaw calls social natural kinds, and that these social groupings allowed people to work together, for cultures to develop, and so on. And in that, they all developed something, some gift that for Du Bois could make the world better.
Because
That was that was going somewhere, right? We
part
don't know
of
where it's
race,
going.
part of race is difference, right?
That's
Part of
right.
race is difference.
That's exactly
so
right.
part of Du Bois's question is, what gifts can difference give
That's exactly right.
to the larger project? But
That's exactly right.
one of the problems of racism is it truncates the imagination of both the oppressor and the oppressed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what
And
do we do as an imaginationless people?
that's it's really difficult because the way race functions, isn't often on or racism a rational register. It's difficult to appeal to people who practice wielding power vis-a-vis race with data and facts. It doesn't really affect the conversation positively. You know, race, the way I want to think about it, racism functions at a much more mythological level. It's a non-rational, unthought, almost reflexive response, primarily to people of color. And so, I mean, you asked a big question that I don't know if I can answer. I mean, honestly, like, so how does one then deal with something that's mythological and non-rational rather than data-driven, factual, and quantitative? It's a really tough question.
Well, maybe the healing from it or the dismantling of racism is about shifting the mythology of it, right? Rather than, so many of the strategies go toward policies and procedures and data
Yeah.
and empirical evidence, right? Okay, fine. We also know that doesn't work real well.
That's exactly the point I'm making.
Suppose the shift in our own consciousness, in our own spirits, in our own abilities to live together, to feel like we all belong. It's still a radical statement to say we all belong.
I think so.
Suppose that's about shifting the mythology that we are living with, which is a bigger problem than shifting the mechanics of the society.
That's right. And it has to be something along the lines of what you're arguing. There has to be something, and again, I'm not trying to be too mystical here, but there has to be something else going on in the world that has the ability to shift that mythology, to disrupt the reproduction of these cycles of violence that we see in America. I think, again, January 6th at the Capitol was just one iteration of these kind of eruptions that happen that are rooted in a mythology of America as this white, pure, innocent space, such that when that feels in jeopardy for some folks, there's this eruption.
Or the Chauvin verdict.
Or the Chauvin verdict.
The Chauvin verdict, that we know now that in the midst of announcing the Chauvin verdict, police were killing other Black
That's exactly
people.
right. That's right. I mean, anytime there's this sense of racial progress or white loss, again, which sort of disrupts the mythology, there's this eruption that whose goal is to reinstitute the myth of beginnings.
And that is the power, the very power of narrative to reassert itself.
That's exactly right.
In nook and cranny ways, right? To reassert itself. So what is it like to because I too am this person, to be an African-American person teaching against and resisting this mythology in our own classroom?
To be an African-American teaching against and with that mythology in the classroom, especially at a research school, is a difficult thing. I don't know if how national Louisiana has been. But today, in fact, Louisiana will vote in the legislature to pass a resolution that will make it illegal to teach about systematic racism and sexism. I don't know if you've heard that.
Yes, I have. Y'all made CNN, MSNBC.
I didn't know that.
Yes, you did.
What a lot of people may not know, which you probably do, is that the representative who proposed this legislation was responding to my co-edited book with Biko Gray and Lori Martin. Insiders are aware of that. People on CNN might not have been aware of that, and maybe around the state they may not have been. But there was a press release on, I think it was February 17th, which announced that we were going to do a panel on our edited book, and the three co-editors of The Religion of White Rage, Lori Biko and I. And there was a quote from me that said something along the lines of the conversation we're having about the importance of religion in understanding the world and white rage, and that the Capitol was one such iteration of these cycles that you and I have been discussing. And people just went wild just at the idea that religion could be a part of making sense of that. And that we would dare to offer a religious interpretation of such white rage. And so now the pushback then, because there's always a backlash, or what I call white consolidation, which is a much more expansive term.
Closing of ranks, right?
That's exactly right. Is to limit the ability then to teach about racism and sexism in the classroom. And, you know, I try to tell folks who are at my institution, Louisiana State University, that, you know, this kind of response isn't new. It's just that nobody's been listening. I mean, we've been trying to register that this kind of thing happens. One of my peers today sent me a text of hate mail that she received just today. I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens when you teach and do work in the area of race and racism, probably at any kind of school, but in Louisiana, at the flagship school, it's a challenging place to be.
So there is a visceral sense of there are some people who cannot belong. Belonging is not possible for some groups of people, some ilks of people, and that legislation must be aligned with the fact that some people will never belong. So the notion of depriving other human beings of belonging has got to be, this is your point, a theological statement. That's right. Not just a legal statement or a sociological statement or even a mathematical statement.
That's right.
That has theological, ethical ramifications for how we make sense of the world.
That's exactly right. And
why I don't like you, Stephen, because that's the kind of stuff you say. That's why I don't like you.
And this sense of belonging, or that we don't belong, is okay as long as it's below the surface. Because everybody can say, you know, we're LSU, we're such and such a school, we're UCLA, until your work comes to the surface, or a student records something that you say, because they do that now, or you end up in campus reform like we have and like some other of our peers have. I've seen them. And all of a sudden, what comes to the surface then is that you have these black people here who have agency, and who are turning this gaze, they're flipping it, and they're daring to say, this is the meaning of such and such a white event or behavior or being, and so on. Then all of a sudden you're hyper seen, right? It was okay before, because you don't belong, but your presence is tolerated. Your presence is, your non-belonging presence is even necessary for the institution to make its claims of fairness and progress and goodness. This is what Biko Gray writes a lot about the necessity, not just of Black invisibility, but Black death for white progress.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a necessity, but when it's made visible by our own agency and our own work, which I'm going to do, nothing is going to stop me from doing that. I don't care who says it, who tries to legislate it, who tries to write policies about it. This is the work that I do. It's the work that I'm going to do. But then when somebody makes a big deal about it, all of a sudden there's this hyper visibility,
So
which is a problem.
Which is a problem for you now,
Right.
and in these situations, and for us in these situations, because if they're coming after you, then they're going to come after the rest of us, right?
That's right.
So you just become the lightning rod, right? For you're just taking the punches while the rest of us are just waiting in the line.
That's just right.
But there are many forms for brothers and sisters in this circumstance in the academy who are being punished for the kind of work, right? That even if it's not as visible as your work is, there are certain kind of cultural punishments that are made when students complain, when colleagues complain. So that's one piece. The second piece is there's got to be a role here for tenure, right? Yeah. The origins of tenure is so scholars can speak freely and put their radicality out there.
I agree.
Without censure or loss of income or unemployment. Is there a role for tenure here?
Well, both of those are really important points that you raise. And, you know, the university, colleges and university, seminaries, all kinds of higher education claim these values. Open and free inquiry, freedom of speech, whatever those might be. One of the things that I have learned and my colleagues have learned and have written about is that when it comes to Black people, and Black people who study race in the way that we're talking about it, these university values or academic values actually gets flipped against us and weaponized. And so you hear these terms, then
say more.
Now here's one of the phrases that you'll always hear: racism in any form won't be tolerated. That in any form is really crucial because that is the term that shows up over and over at universities all across the country against Black men and women who have criticized, as a matter of their work, whiteness, white supremacy, and so on. And so all of a sudden, this idea of racism becomes something that is wielded against African-American scholars who study race and whiteness. And then what follows then are these ideas about fairness and academic freedom and all this other stuff that is used against us. And, you know, presidents at many universities, Boston and Texas A&M, have put out statements against Black scholars in the name of academic freedom, as if by talking about racism that they violated that.
There's been a call to end the teaching of critical race theory.
That's right. And I don't think it's any coincidence that some of the major white denominations have also made that same call. I think those two things are related. Higher education and these religions. I'm not sure how they're related. It's something I'm going to have to think through, and I think I have been thinking through, but they have to be related. Because why would something like critical race theory or critical whiteness studies, which is where I see myself, or Black critical theory, why would those kind of things be something that is offensive to folks who claim not to be racist? And maybe that's why. I mean, maybe the answer is in the question. Maybe because they claim that racism is something in the past, and that talking about racism, teaching classes that explore racism, is itself divisive.
Well, and they say that racism is about Black people and Blackness, not about white people and whiteness. So the fact that critical race theory starts with the presumption that whiteness is problematic, the way it's currently constructed and embodied and acted out in the society, they find untenable.
That's right. You know, I took a look at the proposed legislation. I don't know what time the vote is today for the Education Committee and Representative Garofalo, But one of the things that the legislation argues is that teaching about racism and sexism is divisive because we're all equal. And we should be emphasizing that rather than these divisive conversations that seem to point to the same population, namely white males. And again, I think as this gets discussed in academia, again, it becomes a form of cast as a form of bias against a particular group, rather than something that is factual
So
or
think
operational.
think aloud about the brothers and sisters who are just early career people, and they got affirmed for the dissertations that they
Yeah.
wrote, and they got affirmed by search committees. Yes, bring your scholarship in here. So I'm going to ask for advice. What advice would you give young scholars, Black and white? Because there's a spectrum of scholars who are doing this kind of work.
That's right.
Right? In its controversy, right? In its
Yeah.
controversy.
Yeah.
Give us some advice for those young people who are beginning to face resistance, beginning to face, well, we hired you, but and this isn't what we had in mind.
My advice is going to be a little different probably than the advice that I hear. You know, back in the day, you'll probably remember this. You and I aren't that old, but we can probably both remember when people would recommend that you do a dissertation that would pass easily rather than cause controversy.
Sure.
Right? Mm-hmm. People would say, and I've heard this, wait till you get tenure to do the work that you really want to do. Wait till after you get a job and then you get tenure to do the work that you want to do. I've never been able to function that way because I didn't get into this just for a paycheck or just to do a job. And so I can't do my work any other way than what matters to me and the work that is passionate, that I'm passionate about. So what I tell people who are coming after me, and I've done this several times, is do the work that you want to do, that you think is going to make a difference in the world, but also be aware of the potential consequences and try to plan for that and be strategic about how you do your work. Not to do a different kind of work, not to do a work that's safer or anything like that, but to do things that are strategic. For example, having conversations with your dean about the kind of work that you do and the potential pitfalls out there, the kind of responses that could happen. But do the kind of work that you do. And that really is what I tell people, because this isn't about just having a job and a paycheck. I mean, for me, it really is about something more meaningful. And I'm assuming for the people I'm advising that it matters to them too. And so my advice is always do what matters to you, but be strategic about it and be aware of the potential complications and consequences.
So Dr. Katie Cannon would say, do the work that your soul must have.
That's right.
Right. So that there is a living with integrity involved in doing this kind of passion, right? There has to be integrity. Right. And knowing that we're not naive in these spaces, right? We know how to read these contexts. We can read text and context, right? We should know where we are and what allies we have and those that we do not have.
That's right.
For doing this kind of work. I do think that this is a particularly volatile time in the society, and certain work, certain books that might have gone only noticed by other scholars are now being noticed in the larger public, which I think is marvelous.
It is marvelous, but there are also all these watchdog websites and organizations, right? Again, like Campus Reform, and I've heard from them, but believe me. These conservative websites and organizations, some of which are student organizations, some of which are, are not, which really want to police the kind of discourse that happens in higher education and the kind of things that happen in the classroom. And listen, they will write an article about you. They will contact your administrators. They would do all kinds of things to try to keep young scholars or any scholars from doing the kind of work that they find meaningful.
Mhm.
And it's something that we have to prepare for. But to know that these kind of groups turn, what's the other one? Turn something USA, turn campus reform, turning point USA or something like that. I mean, there's just a bunch of them.
Yeah.
And they're violent.
Well,
And
the unfortunate thing is they're not inviting dialogue. They are policing and shutting down voice, trying to take away agency, trying to punish, right? They're not inviting dialogue.
I agree, but this is but this is exactly what they argue about us,
Mhm.
is that by presenting these perspectives about the world, we are not allowing for a counterpoint. We're not allowing for, in the words in my particular case and that of my colleagues, there should have been a conservative voice to respond. Right? That was the response. And so again, they use these same tropes, um, and they weaponize them against us. You know, here we are, free thinking, doing work that's important to us, scholarly rigor, um, and yet when we do our work, they turn that around and say, no, it's limited, it's narrow. There should have been a fuller range of perspectives, and all of this kind of thing. And it's challenging to navigate those webs. But like we've been saying, you have to be prepared for that, and you have to do the work that your soul needs.
And do not imagine yourself alone, because you're not alone in this work. So give us just a little glimpse of there are joys in doing this work, in this prophetic work, in this activist scholarship intersection, in this place where you are able to put language to some of the most difficult social problems that we are facing in the 21st century. That's what I believe. I believe these are some of the most difficult social problems we will face.
And that's the beauty of the job, because I get to do that and get paid for it.
No,
I mean, I'm not rich,
mm-hmm.
but I'm pretty happy doing
mm-hmm.
what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't see doing anything else and being this happy. The fact that I get to look at a social problem.
Mm-hmm.
I get to look at the Capitol January 6th,
mm-hmm.
and people ask me to say something about that,
mm-hmm.
and what that means, and they trust me to have an expertise
mm-hmm.
and something creative to say that's going to make that coherent to a world that just can't make sense of any of this.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I love that about what we do.
So, and I liken that part of our jobs to being improvisational artists.
That's right. That's right. Because you have to be prepared. I mean, this world, something's always happening,
That's
right?
That's right.
And you have to be able to move
mm-hmm.
left
mm-hmm.
when something goes right,
mm-hmm.
And be prepared just like that to say something. And I get calls from all over the country, from newspapers, from all kinds of organizations, to think on my toes
mm-hmm.
about something that concerns them, and to draw upon all my training and all my research and all my study. And LA Times or somebody might call me later today.
mm-hmm.
And again, that's the improvisation.
So, Dr. Finley, who told you you were free to think, and why did you believe them?
I think Miss Coggins told me that I was free to think, mm-hmm. and that I was smart. Mm-hmm. And this is going to sound funny to some of these listeners. Miss Coggins was actually my kindergarten teacher. Little school in Santa Ana, California, Lincoln Elementary, and she was a Black woman. And if you know how Black children get tracked for being disruptive and all these other things in schools across country, and they get tracked along these lines of remedial education, Miss Coggins looked at that and said, "Nah, he's bright. He's bright." And she put me in what was called MGM at the time. And I don't remember what it meant. I think it meant something like mentally gifted minors.
Mentally gifted minors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when Miss Coggins put me in MGM mm-hmm. and told me I was smart, nobody could ever tell me that I wasn't smart. Not language exams, not qualifying exams, all of which are just incredibly challenging. Mm-hmm. But nobody could ever tell me that I wasn't smart again. Mm-hmm. Not an annual review, mm-hmm. not people calling my administrators mad about the work that I do.
Mhm.
I know that I have something to offer
Mhm.
this world
Mhm.
and scholarship. And it started right there for me, in the classroom, in elementary, in kindergarten.
So we want to be the Miss Coggins for our students,
That's right.
right? We do, right? We want to give our students permission. Now, by the time we get them, they grown, right? They're
That's
adults.
right.
But if they have not had a Miss Coggins yet in their lives, we want to be those people to say, you have what it takes to do this work.
That's right. That's right.
That's pretty powerful.
And like you said, some students haven't heard that until they get to us.
That's right.
And so, we might see that as extra work that we have to do, and it is. Maybe it was extra work for Miss Coggins too. Maybe she was going out of her way to do what she did.
Mhm.
But this is something that we have to do, and I do it all the time. Tell students to do that. First of all, I believe in them, and that I see something in them that often is beyond and greater than their GPAs.
That's right. That's right.
And this encounter happens in the classroom.
Well, and one of my favorite encounters in the classroom with students is to put words to what their Black experience has been in this country,
That's right.
where before they intuitively knew what was happening to them, what their experience was about, because they felt it, right?
They
They
did.
they they felt it. But then to put words to that, to put theory to that, to put language to that, to put concepts to that, is a pretty profound and holy experience.
This is what brings a lot of these students alive.
Mhm.
They've never heard the language that makes their reality coherent in a way that
Mhm.
we can talk about it and connect it to concepts. And this is often what makes them want to do better,
Mhm.
but also to go to graduate school.
Mhm.
And sometimes they hadn't even thought about those possibilities until they've gotten to us. And I'm not saying it has to be just us, because I had a few teachers who weren't Black, who were meaningful, although as a young person most of them were Black, and Black women and one Black man. But a lot of times we're the first Black teachers some of these students have ever had, especially at the college level,
Yep.
and maybe we'll be the only ones.
Yep.
And so this is a particularly powerful opportunity to make a difference, and to make their experience coherent for them, and give them the language to talk about it in a way that they also understand that it's legitimate to think about these things in scholarly ways. Right? And I have to say that because for some people in academia, and especially in some of these social sciences, race isn't always a legitimate area to study for some of these folks, right? And we argue that it is.
It absolutely, well, you know how I feel about it.
I do.
And to tell them they don't have to park their imaginations at the door if they're doing intellectual work, that
That's right.
imagination is a part of doing intellectual work.
That's right. That's right. Imagination is important. Thinking beyond, the and with the tools that we're giving,
Mhm.
putting something new together. I mean, that's what we do. That's what we try to teach our students to do, right? I'm giving you a set of tools,
Mhm.
but I'm expecting you to do something with those tools that are unique to you. So when I ask you to write a paper, I'm not punishing you, right? I want you to put to use the stuff that you've gained in this classroom, in these readings and lectures and discussions and films and whatever tools that we've offered them,
Mhm.
and to do something creative that I wouldn't have done. Maybe I'm not able to do in that same way because I haven't had your particular experience. I'm not you, I'm me. And so, I mean, this is one of the reasons why the classroom is important, why in the bigger sense humanities are important, but I'm always going to argue the study of religion is really important in a time when departments are closing and programs are shutting down all across the country. We
And
need
those
them.
scholars are being dispersed to other departments,
They
right?
sure are. They're putting them in
Mhm.
history and sometimes in social sciences
Mhm.
elsewhere,
Mhm. And sometimes
because
the library.
that's
Seriously,
that's right.
seriously,
Yeah,
all kind of stuff.
that's right. Unfortunately,
Thank you so much, Stephen, for this conversation, for this
I,
needed and valuable conversation.
I love these conversations.
To our viewers and our listeners, the Wabash Center's website is the place to find all of these resources, these many podcasts, webinars, as well as information about our regranting program, about articles, and our journal on teaching is also available on our website. I'd like to thank Rachel Mills, who's our producer. Remind you that Paul Myrie is our musician and composes the music that surrounds our broadcasts, any of our broadcasts, and that we are exclusively funded by Lilly Endowment Incorporated. And we are out. How was that, Paul?